Today's webinar presentation is titled Exploring Silvicultural Strategies in Northern New England, Irregular Shelterwood. Our presenter today is Dr. Bob Seymour, the Curtis Hutchinson Professor of Silviculture, University of Maine School of Forest Resources. Dr. Seymour has been at the University of Maine faculty since 1981, where he has taught courses in silviculture, ecology, and management of the Acadian forest and forest stand dynamics. He holds a BS from Ohio State University and an MF and a PhD from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He has over 40 years of experience in research and management of forests in the Acadian region of northeastern North America and directs the long-term Acadian Forest Ecosystem Research Program. He has authored or co-authored over 90 publications and 5 book chapters on silvicultural subjects. He is an SAF Fellow and has won numerous awards, including the Carl Schenck Medal for National Excellence in Forest Education in 2014 and the David M. Smith Award given by NESAF for Silviculture Leadership in New England in 2015. He plans to retire in August of this year, but will remain active in New England forestry. And so with that, it's a privilege to welcome Dr. Seymour back, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you, Kate, for that gracious intro. Good to talk this morning about a subject that I think has probably been central to my interest my whole career and becoming more and more popular. I've taught it, I've studied it, and I've practiced it on our own woodland. So you're going to get a dose of all three here. How about that? So just an outline, we're going to talk a little bit about the semantics of shelterwood silviculture. There's important concepts here that come to play in irregular shelterwood especially that are really central to much of forestry, or at least silviculture. That's conservation of growing stock. There's a concept that's maybe just New England-ish, are these two rotation species, or something I sometimes call tall regeneration. More about that. There's, of course, the issue of structural retention. I've come to realize, distinguish 3 kinds of that in my work. We'll get to that and talk about the importance of regeneration. This is, after all, a regeneration method, not just structure. We were doing a tour on one of our woodlots. Jessica Leahy and I have a LLC. We have several different properties now. And when I was writing the handout, I was asked to talk about our silviculture. And I said, well, you know, we just basically do irregular silviculture. Fits about 95% of what we need to do in one way or the other. Very flexible system. Why is this? Well, New England forests are complicated. You know, my approach is not don't make them simpler, just deal with it. And we have the tools to deal with it. And this is I guess after a 40-year career, is the way I would choose to do this. So you get my views on this. Shelterwood basically relies on advanced regeneration which is established in partial shade before the overstory is removed. That's the defining feature. Conventionally, all the cuttings occur near the end of the rotation in an even age or maybe 2-age system. All right. This gets relaxed for the irregular variant. We have preparatory cuttings. These are optional and rarely seen, actually. The key step in many cases is the establishment cutting. Used to be called the seed cutting. This is where the regeneration is actually recruited and becomes established if things go well. And then we remove the overstory. This can be done to release the regeneration. This can be done in one cutting or more, or it does not need to be complete. Okay, so that's the steps. The variants based on spatial patterns of the cuttings are of course, uniform shelterwood, the standard simple shelterwood that we all think of, where we do the same thing throughout the whole stand, leaving a uniformly stocked overwood in the establishment stage. A more flexible system, one I've come to like a lot, is group shelterwood, where separate patches of the stand, again, it's in the same stand, these are not separate stands, these patches, are at different stages of the sequence. And you know, you can do this, of course, in strips. Strips are just narrow linear groups, okay? So uniform or group. Group shelterwood has been in the silviculture books, actually until the most recent edition. They took it out for some reason. But it was in the first edition of Hawley and Smith, and there it is. Basically, you just take advantage of naturally established patches of advanced regeneration, the ones in the diagram here, and then gradually expand these outward over time with a series of establishment and then followed by removal cuttings and the different things until the whole stand is regenerated. We can, about 20 years ago, the silviculture terminology folks basically added the term reserves, which are trees that are just left as retention, after the regeneration period's over for reasons other than regeneration. These tend to, if you do this, then you're leaving a 2H stance. So all these variants can have with reserves. And actually, all the even age systems can do this. So Shelterwood is just one of these. So a Shelterwood with reserves, or more common methods. We also have the variants based on timing of the removal cuttings. This is the length of the regeneration period. This is where we get into the irregular. Conventional Shelterwood is a very short regeneration period, like 3 to 5 years. You do the establishment cutting. As soon as the seedlings are established, off comes the overwood. Think black cherry. Think a shade-intolerant species that needs shade to germinate and become established, but then because it's shade-intolerant, it needs full sunlight to grow. Standard Shelterwood. Southern pines might be grown this way, right? Shade is good for almost everything, as we'll see. Our tolerant species in New England, a lot of them need an extended regeneration period, primarily to outgrow competition of more intolerant species. So I started talking about extended Shelterwoods. What I mean by that is regen that reaches breast height, basically. And depending on the overwood density, that would take 10 to 20 years, depending on when you start, right? So, but again, the overwood would eventually be removed, unless you're making more complicated structural decisions here. So the defining feature there is you wait until the trees are saplings, basically, above breast height, and then you remove the overstory, so they have a head start. And then finally, in the subject of today, is irregular Shelterwood, where we really, historically at least, this has been no defined regeneration period. Really, you keep some of the trees from the lower stratum and the old cohort held over into the next rotation. And so that extends the regeneration period indefinitely in some cases. What defines irregular? I guess I would have to say that the regeneration period extends for decades, so longer than the other variants, and ends up, as a result of this, having this irregular, uneven height structure, usually because of multiple partial cuttings and removal cuttings or disturbances. And it relies on advanced regeneration, and thus it's a legitimate variant of the Shelterwood method. Now, in a simple application, eventually all the old trees are harvested, except for any permanent legacies you're leaving for biodiversity, and then the stem would go through several decades of stem exclusion. So it's not a balanced system like a single tree selection or something would be. Okay, so that, but it has a long drawn-out regeneration period. Why do we do this? And why do I like this? I really think that the single feature that's most important to me, it's the best system for growing all trees that we have, this diverse New England forest, where we commonly will have 10 species in the stands with different silvical properties, different maturities, different values. You know the drill. It's the best way to conserve that growing stock and grow it optimally to its whatever size, to maturity, either biological or ecological maturity. And it's because many of these species have this great ability to respond to release after growing in the lower strata for decades. These are, of course, shade tolerant, tend to be late successional species. Here we get to this concept of what Dave Smith used to call two rotation species, or sometimes just tall regeneration, which are old, tall trees, but or short, old trees that can be thought of as old regeneration. We can also use irregular Shelterwood, of course, and this is the modern, one of the reasons it's become more popular, is in sort of restoration silviculture, or the increasing emphasis on complexity in forests that have become simplified, or just in maintaining ones that are already complex. So what are these two rotation species? We all know them. They're later successional species that require essentially two rotations of their early successional associates to reach the canopy and grow to maturity. Okay? So in order to really manage these effectively, you need to maintain at least a 2H structure in a stratified mixed species stand to keep these in the main canopy. If you just use sort of random or full, uniform low thinning, you wipe these things out. So don't do that. You can use low thinning within a species, but not broadly throughout the stand. So, I mean, a lot of people have a misperception that these things won't respond and we need to get rid of them, they're the runts. That's just wrong-headed thinking. Get rid of that. Examples here would be eastern hemlock, white pine growing with the oaks, or central hardwoods. Northern hardwoods would be beech and sugar maple growing in competition with the black cherry out in the Alleghenies, or birch and aspen, even white ash. Red spruce behaves like this, certainly with hardwoods and sometimes on balsam fir in better soils. Northern white cedar almost everywhere. So unless you give these species a head start, you're going to lose them. Matt Kelty, just to illustrate one example, here's Matt Kelty's dissertation work. You have a height growth of oak and hemlock. Oak on the top, the hemlock is always behind it if it starts at the same time. It keeps up, but it's always behind. If you want to keep hemlock in the overstory, you leave it as a residual that's maybe 30 feet tall, and it will grow more slowly after release. The oak will catch up to it, but it will stay in the main canopy. Again, a hemlock down here is going to stay below. Okay, so that is a two-rotation species. For the hemlock to get up here, it needs to grow twice as long as the oak. Okay, so we have lots of examples. I would just simply define irregular shelterwood, and this is my own sort of new cut on it based on this webinar thinking, is any system that's going to rely primarily on advanced regeneration, maintain a diverse vertical canopy structure that includes merchantable trees that you could cut. I mean, they're out there. They're smaller probably than being mature, but they're there. And you could remove them if you wanted to make a more uniform canopy. And that does not use any kind of diameter distribution as a target, right? Unlike, say, a BDQ, single tree group selection approach. You can, in some cases, if you're using groups, have area-based targets or not. So this is both. I'm using Kevin O'Hara's multi-age silviculture book here where he talks about this. This system, in his view, and in my view too, of course, is that this is both about structural retention and regeneration. We can't just focus on one or the other. It is a silvicultural system, and that requires both. Okay, back to this three components. Now, retention, of course, has been popular, and it's been, as I've managed, mostly this came in the managing our AFERP research study, which we'll talk a little bit about. We're initially first set up to leave permanent biological legacies, you know, the Jerry Franklin concept, to meet biodiversity goals. That's one form of retention, right? A tree, in other words, that's left after an or some kind of harvest that's regenerating something. We also, of course, to manage the regeneration process, leave overwood in the Shelterwood method. The purpose of this overwood is both to shade the understory, so we don't have bright light conditions, and also, of course, to provide seed for the new cohort to be established, if that's what we're trying to do. So that's overwood, and that's temporary. That can be removed later once it's done its job. And then, finally, we may have immature trees, these two rotation trees of small size that have growth potential that are not yet financially mature. Those are merchantable. We could cut, you know, an 8-inch sugar maple and throw it in the pulp pile, or an 8-inch spruce, which we often do. Whether that's good silviculture depends, I guess, on a lot of what you want to grow. That maple, of course, is below value. It could become a highly valued sawlog. So we have the old concept of growing stock can also be retained as reserve trees. These would all be reserves. Three kinds of retention, and we're going to parse this out in an example later. Now, my colleague Patricia Raymond and her colleagues up in the Quebec Ministry wrote a wonderful paper, and this should be assigned reading for anybody that's into irregular shelterwood. This was in the Journal of Forestry in 2009. Patricia sort of did a wonderful review and grouped these irregular shelterwoods into three cases where she called expanding gaps, continuous cover, and extended. The extended is on the right here. I mean, we're not going to get into the diagrams in detail. That is sort of the simplest version of this, where somewhat like my earlier version of extended. And then you have the more complex versions which are expanding gap and group. Or continuous cover rather. I like to think of these as group because you don't have to. You can make gaps, but you don't have to expand them. Yet it's still a group-wise approach, so it'd be a little more inclusive. These, of course, have old European roots. Troop's book here in 1928 is a good reference here. Spur's 1956 article in Forest Science. Under the Femelschlag system, the German term, which Klaus Putman can translate for us if we want. It doesn't matter. We translated irregular shelterwood. The Swiss Femelschlag is the continuous cover variant. The Bavarian Femelschlag is the groupish one, where the groups are established and then expanded outward. This is the one that we've used as a model for our AFERP experiments, and one that I like best. But nothing certainly wrong with the continuous cover. They're both very irregular Shelterwood-based systems, right? Now, Pootman, in writing this great critique of silviculture in 2008, basically pointed out to us that Americans sort of selectively imported the simpler German systems, but overlooked these more complicated ones. So it's one reason, I guess, why we haven't had more application of these until more recently. I think in places like Maine, we've always had some people applying these. Other places, no. Let me just cite some examples here. We have what I would call extended uniform Shelterwoods with large reserve trees. This is a fairly new thing. These trees are valuable. You get this distinctly two-storied structure with this system. Then we have more truly irregular Shelterwoods with old but short reserve trees. The holdover trees are this tall regeneration of these two rotation species. And then we have the more complicated ones, which are the irregular group Shelterwoods with or without reserves. And these include these expanding gap Femelschlags. These are, I think, all fall under this, a rubric of irregular Shelterwood, but have subtly different structures. Just consider this. If you go down to the Massachusetts Fish and Game lands, you'll see them do a lot of this, these uniform Shelterwoods. Up comes oak and pine and other birch, probably regeneration, maple. And then they leave this permanent retention of largely large oak, mass-bearing oak trees in the overwood. They never remove these, and you got this sort of distinctly two-storied structure. This could just be thought of as an extended Shelterwood with reserves, but historically, probably most people, because of that retention, would consider this a simpler version of irregular Shelterwood. But the stand is sort of uniformly regenerated over a short period. Some landowners up here in Maine will grow spruce fir this way. They'll regenerate it uniformly, and then you'll have these smaller diameter spruces and pines and cedars left over that aren't worth much, if anything, now, because the pulpwood markets for these things have gone away. Might as well leave those. They will grow. They won't compete with this tolerant regeneration. So you have these, again, two strata, but the trees are relatively small. These are the holdovers, the tall, what I think, this tree may be 100 years old. I just think of it as a tall sapling, even though it might be actually pole size. It's going to respond and grow into a nice tree, typically. So again, the stand's uniformly regenerated, so you could think of this as Shelterwood with smaller reserves. But again, that's irregular shelter because of the structure. I think now we get to the more complicated things. The irregular group Shelterwood, the AFERP study, is one that we've been managing for a long time, since the mid-90s here on the Penobscot Experimental Forest. I've talked about this in some length in the webinar that I gave last year on spruce fir silviculture. It's an example of irregular group Shelterwood. Whoop, sorry, I lost this. Sorry. So this is large half-acre to 1 acre plus groups with some retention, 15% of permanent legacy, plus any growing stock that we might have that we would keep for a while, maybe half a rotation, and any overwood that we would need to make sure that our establishment of seedlings came out better. And here in this case, we're keeping them. So these gaps make up initially 20% of the stand. That's just arbitrary. Now they cover 60%. We've kept the matrix fairly fully stocked. You could certainly thin through that. The main thing is not to try to regenerate everything, or it just becomes a uniform Shelterwood, right? If the whole stand were like this is, again, we're peering into a group here, this would be continuous cover, Femelschlag, right? So the group-wise gives you more spatial variance. So here's just this is just a reference, if you want to come back and look at this, to my earlier webinar on spruce fir, where I talked about this AFERP study in depth. I'll mention it here briefly, just so as a reminder, because I'm sure it will be new to some of the attendees here. Here's a map of one of the replicates of what we call the large gap treatment. This is irregular Shelterwood with reserves. The lighter blue here were the original gaps. 20%, every cut here on a 10-year cutting cycle is meant to regenerate 20% of the stand. So after 5 entries, the whole area will be regenerated, leaving reserve trees. Okay, so we just finished the 3rd entry here, this darkest blue color, And you can see one thing we're doing is that we're not expanding these out just purely geometrically. As we got into this third entry, we realized if we started doing that, we would end up with a lot of little slivers and stuff. We wanted to try to promote an intact matrix as much. So the type of conditions we're leaving now in these entries that we've done on the third cycle are a little bit different than what we started with, where these groups were more fully regenerated and so forth. So this is a very asymmetric. You can do whatever you want here, but this is just our experience. One beauty of this system, and when I saw this Femelschlag in the Black Forest in 1993, it just registered on me that this makes it, when you're relying on advanced regeneration, you want to avoid trying to drive machines through it, otherwise you're not going to have a well-stocked cohort, right? On our typical uniform shelterwoods, now we do overstored removal, we run trails every 60 feet, we're down to, we may wipe out 15 or 20% of the stocking. That's not ideal. If you do it in groups, you can work around the edges of these groups and never have to drive through the regen again. And this is the beauty of it. This is the way the Germans do it. They'll use large tractors with winches, and they'll pull the wood out of there, and they'll never, everything is fully stocked, and that would be borne out. So we look at these now, at least our 20-year groups, they're well stocked with virtually no trails through them. The whole area here, only less than 5% of the stand area is in trails. That's way different than a uniform shelterwood. So this is a major operational advantage. Here's a view into expansions we just did into some very dense, actually, hemlock stuff. It's clearly in spruce, pine, stem exclusion. We couldn't just daylight this. We get no regeneration. So we left a fairly substantial overwood here, both of growing stock trees and of some other scattered hemlocks, just to give us the shade conditions we wanted. Here's a large gap. After the second entry, we'll just point out the different types of retention here. Here's a large old maple. That's clearly a legacy. This pine probably left as a legacy. I suppose it could also be harvested as growing stock, although it's large, probably mature. Now here's some of this immature growing stock. Here's a hemlock out in the gap. We don't want to grow that hugely big, but that tree was probably 8 inches when we left it. We cut a bunch of them. Here's a red spruce, an old red spruce that was near the edge of the gap that's going to respond well. Here's an umbrella spruce that's come out of that umbrella status and is responding well. That's its nature. Leave every one of those you find. And then finally we have new regeneration, actually, filling in among all of these, this other residual structure. So this is just perfect. I mean, this personifies this irregular group shelterwood system, in contrast to what more uniform systems where you could just come in here, do a simple uniform shelterwood, all the stuff would be cut, that you'd have maybe leave reserves for, maybe leave this maple or something, but you run over this spruce or leave it, but it doesn't get protected. The stand is much more uniform, and if that's what you want, you can do that. But this is a way to conserve this diversity that's there if you want to. I've often talked about the advantages here of these group-based systems. It manages regeneration deliberately, not by assumption of some future ingrowth, but you can form the gap sizes, regeneration rates to do that. If you're into natural disturbance emulation, it's a perfect way because it's area-based. You can just relate that directly. More about that in the other webinar if you want to follow on to that. It doesn't assume any relationship between age and size like the BDQ diameter distribution approach does. So those are all problems with that approach. These irregular group shelterwood has none of those. Operationally, it is much easier to do. The layout's all mostly focused on a small fraction of the stand. You just connect them up with trails, flag the openings, GPS them, whatever. And you're done. Designate retention. You don't work throughout the entire stand. You don't need any pre-harvest diameter distribution to make a marking tally like you would in a BDQ, and you can actually do light harvest because the volumes are very concentrated. They're essentially little mini clear cuts to the logger except for whatever retention you're leaving. We've done these. We've never had to subsidize a single one of them in the stumpage. Reserve trees in these studies, there's legacy, which are mostly wildlife trees, uncommon species. We have growing stock also. We just do it by, we have 15 square feet as the target. We just go out in the gap. This is dispersed retention. We try to have a 1-in tree with a 15 bath prism everywhere in the gap. Very simple to do this once you have a target. Now here's the good news story. We just published this in the Forest Ecology and Management. Dave Carter, a master's student of mine, just finished last year, 2 years ago. look at the fate of 820 of these reserve trees. 92% of them are still standing out there. This is amazing. This is like incredibly different than almost all the other studies of these long-term retention trees and other worldwide experiments. It's primarily because these trees are growing in gaps. They're not exposed like out in the middle of a big clear cut or a uniform shelterwood. Even remarkably, trees that I thought would be mostly blown down by now, red spruce, notoriously not wind firm. We had 150 of those. 88% of them are still standing, right? I mean, some of them did go down, but the survival here has just been remarkable. The growth response has also been exceptional. These things actually respond, and we have another manuscript and review on that. So enough about AFERP. That's the research. Now, there's much more there, okay? Let's talk about some of my own land here, our own land, which Jessica and I bought from Ron Locke, who had owned this property for over 40 years, from the 1960s until 2 years ago. It's a Forest Guild model forest. It's in Quebec, Maine. This is one small stand in it, 16-acre pure northern hardwood, high site for Maine at least, site 72 for ash. It has some mold veterans, so it's sort of a subtly 2H stand. It was treated with an improvement cut in 78, light harvest around 2000. Okay, so this posed an interesting question. I wanted to use this for my silviculture class last fall, so we went in and did some marking. The question is, okay, what are our options for this piece of ground, right? So being an academic and interested in silviculture, there's our prescription, right? That's what it takes to get it on one slide. It has 11 elements, mostly how to deal with the individual species, but if you parse it out, it's mostly a crown thinning to release valuable northern hardwood crop trees, which is, of course, what we would hope almost anybody would do in such a stand, because it's immature. Even though it's 80, the average QMD is like 10, 11 inches. They're not ready to cut. Bill Leake actually gave a workshop here a few years ago before we owned the property. He prescribed a dominant thinning in here, and which was a good prescription, at least with the paper birch. It's all mature. The other trees, I'd say it's more crown thinning. Anyway, so we marked this. We're gonna go mark this for a thinning. We went out and did it last fall. We put in residual stand crews, very detailed, 1 plot per acre, just to make sure the data were of a high quality. Hit the BA right at 72, a little bit above the northern hardwood B line. QMD 10 inches, just sort of right on the cusp of becoming all saw timber. 14 of the 18 points that we put in were between 60 and 100 square feet of basal area. So great, man, we hit it, right? And this is when it was a joy to mark that. However, we noticed later that, well, not every acre in the stand is like this. You know, 4 of the points were under 40 square feet of basal area. So, you know, that's going to regenerate something whether we're doing that deliberately or not. The understory, we also knew from the crews, was dominated completely by beech and fir. So, of course, what happens when you do this, just thin through everything, you're going to release all this stuff. It's not the objective here. So we went back and we sort of looked at, we're going to lay out some kind of a regen prescription over here over some fraction of the stand that's appropriate, right? So we did that. So here's the stand. Let's just contemplate our options here. Now, this is what I hear, being a New England forester, what people might consider doing to these things. One option, which I have been trying to argue against for quite a long while, these just large patch cuts, 5-acre patch cuts. That's to scale in this 16-acre stand. I don't like those for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it's too much area in this stand in addition to all the other ecological drawbacks of it, and I'll get to those in a minute. So let's dial this back. What about just putting in 3 half-acre patches? Okay, the light environment there is slightly better, but it's still too open. If there's no retention in these patches, it's hard to make these align with where the regeneration needs to go. It's just geometry. So, you know, we just rejected that, right? We need to do some more detailed layout. So if that's too much light, why not go in and put the same, let's just put in some 10th acre patches, the same area, 15 of these. That will probably give us the more shaded regeneration conditions we want, but it's even harder, if you think about it, to align these with what in the stand actually may need to be, or telling us it needs to be regenerated. Why would you do this either? It's sort of just random circles in the stand. So that also got rejected. Now I'm going to digress here just briefly as a regeneration primer. The main thing you need to avoid if you're regenerating New England species is direct sunlight. Okay, now there's too many people I think have lost sight of this lesson. And So that's one problem of these large gaps with no retention. And then often you see immature growing stock, these 2-rotation trees, just being needlessly sacrificed owing to some false belief that we need to put everything back to the ground and that they won't respond to release or they'll become wolf trees. In some cases that's true. Some cases it's not. You have to be discriminating about this. In fact, just the opposite is true. If you don't keep those trees, you're going to lose them, as we saw earlier. Now we can go back here. This is, again, the old knowledge. 1965, Dave Marquis, who of course went on to be the high priest of Allegheny hardwood silviculture, in his earliest career worked at the Bartlett. He published this great book, little bulletin, in 1965 on the light environment in patch cuttings. On the left here, these are half-acre patches of different configurations, okay? Shaded, and the shade is the black, the light colored part is what's in the sunlight at different parts of the day in June. And there's an assumption about a canopy height of about 70 feet or something like that, I forget. Anyway, so here's a half-acre gap, and you see that there isn't actually any difference between the configurations when you get right down to it. In the middle of the day, several hours, much of this gap is in the bright sunlight, right? A half-acre. 58% over the course of the day is the figure, right? So that's too much for most of our species, unless we have a very wet year. Here's the 10th acre. Now, 10th acre, of course, more shaded, obviously, because you got more edge effect. But look at here, again, 3 or 4 hours in the midday, half of that gap is in the bright sun. So that is not ideal. So you got some of it might actually be too shaded for what you want. The rest of it's in the bright sun. Why are we trying to manage light with these geometric shapes? Why don't we do it some other way? Here's an actual, I've seen way too many of these things. Here we have a patch cut, I think, nominally designed to eliminate beech, right? Go out and whack it. First of all, there's no advanced regeneration there of desirable species. If there were a lot of sugar maple seedlings there, this would be overstory removal. That would probably work, right? They would outgrow the beech. In this case, there weren't any. We can see beech stump sprouts or root suckers coming up, and that's about it. Nothing is going to grow well in this bright sunlight. And that actually, guess what, includes paper birch, which we would think would be okay. Marquis's own experiments showed that that came up better in light shade. And any seed bank, that should be seed bank, not seed back species, sorry about that, like white ash and black, black cherry out in the Alleghenies is also in the seed bank. You daylight that black cherry and it inhibits the seed germination. Same with white ash. That may not be commonly known, but now you've heard it. And you're going to get your regen here is just entirely from the beech root suckers, which you're going to have to either spray if you haven't done that already, and the seed bank of stuff like rubus that is going to be inhibited. So that's just going to be a mess. The only place this is appropriate is if you're trying to grow aspen. So I don't like this, right? It just doesn't meet the goals. There's actually, if you look at this wonderful paper that Ralph Nyland and his students wrote, where he looked at the whole literature on trying to remove offending beech as interferent species, there's very little in there about making patch cuts, and basically what it says is that they're largely ineffective. I'm also getting this in many Maine landowners. We just had a presentation at NESAF. One large Maine landowner has given up on these things. They just don't work well for the reasons that we're going to get into here. Well, if we make them for birds, but we also just heard that that down in at the same NESAF meeting, the people at Yale, all the silviculture bird ecologists there, have done these studies of these open oak shelterwoods that Mark Ashton has been putting in for 20 years now. This is better bird habitat for these early successional birds than our clear patch cuts with no retention. So how about that for a news flash? It just, not that patch cuts won't hold them, but this is even better. So you don't need to, put everything to the ground. So back to our actual plan here. What are we actually going to do? Well, so we went on, we just located an acre and a half in the corner of the stand that's low, poorly stocked, needs regeneration, and we marked a low-density shelterwood overwood, and in that group, favoring yellow birch and white ash. Why not, right? That's what it needs. So this idea that you make gaps and then for somehow it's written in stone somewhere that you can't leave retention is just a silly notion. I don't know where that came from, actually. It never was taught to me. But you see that a lot in practice. Oh, where you make a gap, we can't leave trees standing out in it. That's just the wrong attitude. Make the gap to define the area that needs to be regenerated and then leave the retention that you need, and then you don't have to fool with all this geometry of circles and all this other stuff. The gap becomes the gap. And it's much more uniform out there by controlling the overwood density. So remember our equation here. Retention, overwood, the Shelterwood overwood plus any permanent legacy plus any growing stock you want to grow longer, right? So we got three things to think about here. So there's our overwood to scale. We can go to this wonderful paper that Bill Leake and Carl Tubbs put out 30 years or more ago now, where we can take basal area by the northern hardwood species and figure out what the crown coverage is. So for yellow birch here, we want a fairly open canopy. So we actually we marked this and actually tallied it as a sort of a research exercise in preparation for this webinar too. We had 17 square feet of yellow birch, 13 inches roughly. 76 of that overwood was yellow birch. 50% of these birch trees were also growing stock, so they're doing double duty, some of them just for seed. If you look at the Bill's publication there, that's 20% crown closure, 13 trees per acre, 57 feet apart. Okay, so there's our overwood, very open. Now we add in our legacy. We're leaving scattered, large, resistant beech and a couple of big hemlocks just for diversity, right? 13, 14 inches there as well. That's less than 5% crown closure, 5 trees an acre. And then finally, hiding out there in plain sight are these growing stock trees, 10 square feet of small red maple, ash, yellow birch, sugar maple, 20 per acre, 47 feet apart, 8 inches roughly. So that's the sum total. The sum total retention in that patch is now marked to be 38 trees per acre, 30% crown coverage, which is just perfect for yellow birch, okay? And that, when we first marked through it, without thinking about this regeneration aspect, we're just thinning, we're leaving stuff that probably shouldn't have been left, like red maple, just to try to keep the thinning uniform, and we only left 45 square feet. So what we did is we actually went back in and took this down some, but certainly not the bare ground. So we added this prescription element. This is an establishment cutting then in a gap within this irregular framework of irregular shelterwood rather. What makes this irregular? If that was a whole stand, that'd just be a classic shelterwood, but it's irregular because the whole stand as a whole is still largely being thin, right? So parts of that will be treated like this down the road in future cutting cycles. And I think also the other thing that you would say makes it irregular is the retention of this tall regeneration. So just to show you this, here's the retention flag, the yellow just for emphasis. Here's a yellow birch, here's an ash. The blue painted are the ones that we marked in the first pass with paint gun. There's a beech. Here's the one we added later to get the overwood down to what we wanted to. I will bet a lot of money that this stand there will regenerate the yellow birch and the white ash way better than that will. I mean, I just would bet a lot of money on it with no more effort, really. So don't do this stuff, unless you want aspen, then go do something else. Also in this stand here we have two small, 5-6 inch sugar maple poles, perfectly formed, the same age as those. This is 80 years old. It's 6 inches in diameter, and it's just ready to grow well. And even our umbrella red spruce right here hiding in plain sight, one of my favorite trees. One of the few in the stand, that's good growing stock. That'll grow into the overstory, as we saw earlier. Save those trees, flag them if you need to so they don't get run over. Because it's awful, when I was out here doing some cultural work, which I'll show in a minute, I actually cut one of these down because I thought it was a beech. We're out there, there was snow in the bark, it was wet, and so it's subtle, right? You need to if you're doing this with mechanical operations, you need to somehow designate these things. Now, so it's not just about managing structure. In this case, we also, remember, this is a regeneration treatment. We need suitable conditions where the overstory is not fully stocked. And if you don't do that, you get this widely distributed malaise that we have in a lot of these shade-tolerant forests where the understory just becomes the overstory just by drifting up into it, right, by no conscious management. Things like fir, is the enemy in most coniferous forests, that way beech and northern hardwoods. It's generally things we don't want, right? At least we don't want monocultures of them, but that's what will happen. We don't take action. This is by the way, one of the great advantages I think of these group-based approaches, Shelterwood, because it forces you to pay attention to this stuff. Okay, here's a group, man, and it's not just about the overwood. We got to look down and see what we're going to get. And maybe this stuff is there, maybe it isn't. If it is, then you're going to deal with it. So we needed to, and that's the concept here is that the difference between high shade, which is desirable from the high overwood trees, the seed-bearing trees, versus low shade, which is right in the face of any desirable regeneration that you want to recruit or that might be there underneath this. stuff in the mid-story and tall understory, beech saplings, fir saplings, right? This is bad news because it just blocks all the available light to newly generating seedlings. You got to get rid of that or run over it. So we did. Went out there, a new tool here. This is an example of after the beech, in a pace that was dominated by beech, all cut off. We scored the larger ones and injected them. So they're done. All these stumps were sprayed. So they're dead. Here's a patch that was more dominated by fir. You can see there the overwood trees, a yellow birch. There's, I think, just a red maple we left for, just to have a uniform overstory. But that fir, half of it was rotten. It's 40 years old, a lot of it, and it would respond for sure, but it's not something we want to be growing there. Spruce would be okay. Hemlock would be okay, not the fir. This is greatly facilitated. Now, this is a bit of an aside, and this is thanks to Rick Morrill, now in Vermont, when he was here at Baxter, alerted me to this wonderful tool, which you can't buy in the United States. It's a Husqvarna 535 backpack chainsaw. You can zap all kinds of saplings down with this in no time. We took us an acre-and-a-half gap. It took me 2 hours to take out probably 1,000 fir trees and 400 beech trees. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't counting, but they're gone, and then spray the stump. So very efficient. Of course, you could just do that with harvesting machinery. So again, follow through. Make sure the regeneration prescription is as it should be, just as you would in the larger block. But it just makes it easier, right? These multi-age approaches tend to, it's easy to avoid regeneration, but not if you do the groups. You can run into situations where you just got no options in these stands. You get into a big pocket of beech, pure beech, nothing to leave, or you may be in stands where you've inherited something from a prior owner, prior cutting, where there's no regeneration, right? I've got two examples here, again, from our own woodlots, both in this one in Mariahville, Maine, down east. Yellow birch, hemlock kind of community. But there was a patch of beech. When we painted the whole lot for this sort of irregular, thinning Shelterwood, there was nothing to leave out here in about an acre-and-a-half, 2 acres. And we finally said, okay, well, I'm not going to leave diseased beech. We'll just cut it all and we'll plant it. We can get generous money from NRCS to do this if it's done properly. So that's what we did. We cut as much beech as we could down to 5 inches, and then we hacked and squirted the residuals, and then came back the next spring and planted red oak in these tubes. And there's also white pine out there. On a widely spaced, a crop tree, kind of long-term crop tree spacing. And I'm sure, of course, the regeneration will fill in. There were aspens. We'll get some aspen suckers, and we'll have a nice diverse forest. But we won't just have this pure beech coming back, right? These have all been killed now, except for any resistant ones. So the oak in the tubes, because of the deer. Here's one gap, though. The lot was harvested before we bought it. The operator went into these pockets of large hemlock and just made these groups, right? So here's this sort of mindless group approach here, not paying attention to the regeneration process. 4 years later, we came to harvest this throughout. These things were completely dominated by raspberry, right? So over top, there was nothing desirable growing in them. So they were in dense stem exclusion, opened up, nothing germinated, of course, and except for the raspberry seeds in the forest floor. So I had to go in. We went in and sprayed those with glyphosate, killed them stone dead, and then did the same enrichment planting in the following spring. More in this case, this is lower on the slope, more pine, 3.0 white pine from the New Hampshire nursery. Great stock. So these things are doing really well. We wouldn't have done this in the first place, but if you have it, it's you can definitely deal with it. So that's sort of always the last option. Then, if natural regeneration just isn't going to work, then go with the artificial. We know how to do that with enrichment planting. Just briefly, some other New England examples. We just had tours of this at the NESAF meeting. This is our own land. I would say our own, the School of Forest Resources here in Maine. Our Demerit School of Forest has become our probably standard operating system for our white pine hemlock forest. You can see older white pines here that are probably 100, 110 years old. We can see some more immature as an oak, I think, a red oak growing in the same stand. Decent white pine regeneration being long extended so that it will get up above the weevil, and then other hardwood species. Here's a spruce tree, and there would be hemlock poles throughout this. So classic irregular shelterwood, opening it up enough, mostly in this case time with white pine seed crops if we're making gaps. Again, removing interfering mid-stories where we can, although we haven't done a perfect job of that. That can really catch up on you, especially with hemlock. and fir, and trying to replace our pine, which is growing in mixed species stands, with more of the same. It seems to be working. Time will tell. Here we are at the Baxter Scientific Forest Management Area. Eben Zivotowski, the forester there now, Rick Morrill before him, Jensen Bissell, Carol Rettelsheimer before those people, are in some cases, where they have this diverse mixed wood red spruce forest, they're doing these targeted groups to try to just release these older red spruce trees. Again, the 2 rotation red spruces so they can get in the canopy. Excellent. And Evan is also he's got other applications of irregular shelterwood. I would probably, most of what he does is that. Here I was 3 years ago now, almost, over in Vermont. Foresters had me over, and we were looking at some of these Acadian Famelschlag emulations, and here we are, and I think it was a beautiful example of what they were doing. Jared and others here to release patches of red spruce that had become uncommon, again, buried in the understory of these hardwood stands from probably a history of heavy cutting. I think in this case there could have been more retention in the gap itself, but it was still, it was an excellent application of this group-wise approach to meet these objectives of restoration. I think we don't want to forget about an older version of this. Maybe arguably the oldest one, and maybe the most ingenious one, is on the MDC lands down in Massachusetts, the Quabbin watershed, and others. Matt Kelty and Dave Kitteridge and Tom Snowman published this paper in the Northern Journal back in 2003 that describes this approach, and I think this is worth repeating. This, of course, the effort here is more managing for water quality than it is for silviculture, but of course you want the trees coming back, ideally of what you're harvesting to some degree. So you can read this paper. The paper describes, single tree approaches versus group and patch approaches, where you keep or remove this mid-story. If you look at, on the South Quabbin at least, there are some beautiful examples of this. These are fairly large groups. Irregular structure, see the pines coming in. The pine especially is easy to regenerate here. The oak not so much because of the history of deer high herbivory, although that had been getting better, at least when I was there last in 2009. So another excellent application, just, where the reluctance to regenerate the entire stand, of course, because of the water quality issues, still grow high value timber, regenerate the species out in the open, but with retention, right? You see clear retention there of seed trees and overwood trees. Here's just another view of it, a pine tree out in the middle of the gap. Steve Ward, Randy Stone, just great practitioners of this. It's been around for everything. So to wrap up here, I mean, this is, people ask it, well, you think this is a panacea? Well, there's a danger. Dave Smith always said there's no panacea for anything in silviculture. If there was, this books would be a lot shorter. This is not going to work if you have heavily exploited stands or, fire origin stands or something, young, even-age stands dominated by, shade-tolerant, early successional, short-lived species. If that's what you're stuck with, or that's what you've chosen to manage for, then you're going to need to do something else, right? You can still probably do patches, but if you want the species composition to change, you are going to have to go to that enrichment planting and leave structure probably as well, which you can do, but that's a long way down the road. So don't go there in the first place if you can help it, but if you've inherited this, then you just may have to have some simpler, probably just some 2H system that will gradually get you out of this uniform thing if that's what you want. I think another reluctance, if you're into predictability and simplicity, and I can see, if I had to manage 1 million acres, I would certainly believe in this. Predicting stand development of these complicated forests, group or otherwise, with these multi-stories and 15 species, is not simple. And I don't think models like FVS, as useful as it is in many cases, is just not going to work well in this. Problematic, and it's just because of the spatial irregularity. So if you need that kind of quantitative precision, then there's going to be a tendency to to do things in this diversity. So take home messages here, I guess, that of what I would like to leave with you, and this could be a day-long seminar, obviously. When you encounter variable stands that are reasonably well stocked but patchy, I guess is one way to put it, which is probably the typical New England situation on woodlots and large properties, you just think of this group Shelterwood approach, where the stand needs to is telling you it's regenerating or it wants to, make a group. And then forget about what size the group needs to be. Just make the group and then leave whatever retention you need to control the light environment in that group and to leave legacy if that's your objective. To get away from this geometry, these geometrical regeneration patches, especially ones with no retention, unless you're growing aspen, right? Put the patches where they need to be, leave the overwood to create the light in the understory, and when you do this, as I just said, the size of the group becomes irrelevant. This business, whole business, oh, we use 10th acres, we use 5th acres, we use whatever, that shouldn't be what we're talking about. We should be talking about the overwood conditions we're leaving in these regenerated patches. Always take every opportunity to conserve this small diameter growing stock, right? These 2 rotation species, right? So we know what those are, but if you don't do that with everything, you have ones that are not like beeches, and I suppose beech, if it were free of disease, would be like this, but it isn't. Most beech is diseased, and if you leave it down there, it will, block regeneration of the better species. So then we need to think about that as offending low shade and get rid of it. Same with fir, same with other, striped maple, other things like that. So manage regeneration. Don't just get hung up in structure. You need to do both. It's fun to manage and go painting through, looking at the different structures once you get them in your head, but don't ignore what's in the understory. And then finally, depending on how your biodiversity objectives, I think we all have these now, at least we should, leave permanent legacies, right, of things, whatever is there. That will, that's, again, obvious to experienced foresters what those are, big old trees primarily, things that become scarce under heavily managed landscapes. That becomes part of the retention, part of the overwood. It's obviously not growing stock. Growing stock and legacy are mutually exclusive, but legacy, and everything is part of the overwood. So you need to do this skillfully. Here are some references. These are the papers I referred to. If you want to go back and read this at your leisure, hopefully you can read this. And that's it. I will take questions. I guess we got 5 minutes. I went a little over from a late start, I guess.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob. Yeah, we do have a few questions that have come in, and just a reminder to folks, if you do have a question, please feel free to use the question box in the side panel of GoToWebinar. Or there are a number of you who are signed in as staff, so you might also be able to submit questions in the chat box. So some of the questions that have come in, Bob, there's a question here about, have you used dense rubus and gaps to protect high preferable browse species?
Not intentionally, no. And I don't have much experience with that. I think that would be, yeah. I think when I see the dense rubus, I think I've already let in too much light. So, but that doesn't mean that doesn't happen from other natural causes too. I guess short of tubing the trees, I guess I would tend to use heavy slash rather than rubus. I think it'd be more effective. They try to get your harvesting operations to leave tops, either cut the length systems or the old-fashioned skidder systems, whole tree with big tops left in the woods, in those regeneration patches. Dead shade. It's like high shade. High shade is good. Diffuse light. Dead shade is also good because it's low to the ground but doesn't compete with the tree. So, and also would keep the deer from wandering through there to some degree. Yeah.
Great. Can you discuss whole tree versus cut-to-length operations? Cut-to-length leaves some more microclimate conditions, although sometimes impenetrable. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, that beach gap that I showed was if you were paying attention, there's a heavy slash trail going right through the middle of it. It becomes unplantable. That didn't bother me that much because it's only, 15 feet wide. I just find, just as an ethic almost, and most of what I like to do, it's either with cable skidders if you don't want any geometry at all, if you can get a good one, or long reach dangle head cut the length systems. I think with skilled operators can do 90% of what you want. And I like leaving the residues in the woods. You can get by much smaller landings. The markets for tops and stuff are poor now everywhere. So leave that stuff in the woods. Leave it dispersed if you can. Concentrate it in the trails with the cut to length. We've been, good luck with the Prentice and Carlisle, who operates in Maine, and I guess in New York, and many other companies are buying these too now. I notice they're really catching on. These Ponzi systems are just excellent for these. They offer some directional felling. We used these on our AFRIP experiments last time, and to avoid, I was worried about damaging regeneration from the inability to directionally fall trees out of the gap, but they had no trouble at all. It was just elegant. So their productivity is high, so you have to keep up with them. But I think you need to, if you can mark the stands, they can cut them, or you can give them a GPS file and of gaps and trails, and they'll go do it. So I definitely like to cut the length.
Great, thanks, Bob. A few more questions that have come in. With respect to the importance of function of reserve trees for limiting the amount of sunlight that hits a cleared area, can a portion of the reserves, say the legacy cohort, be downed and left on site to limit sunlight while simultaneously limiting deer browse on the next generation?
I think that would probably work. I think it's I think you would need a lot of them to do that. I tend to like to leave my reserve trees standing. They will eventually die. They won't necessarily die at the time you need to facilitate regeneration, but if they're casting high shade, they'll do that job. They won't, of course, protect the regeneration from the deer. This whole business of herbivory is a really tough problem, and I don't have good answers about how to deal with that, other than leave slash if you can. The real answer, of course, is to get deer populations down everywhere. The tubes will work for sure, but that's $5 a tree, and that becomes non-economical really quickly, right? So, yeah, shoot the deer, like Ralph says.
Well, a few more questions for you here. How often do you have to perform a sanitation cut to remove white pine that gets weevil?
Oh, that's a whole other question. I don't. Whenever you can. I mean, it's the sanitation aspect of that is not going to be very helpful, because unless you do corrective pruning of the leaders when the weevil are in the pupal stage in those leaders, then you can remove them. I've done that actually. We have a weevil resistance study to collect weevils and re-release them. You can raise them to adults, or you can take those leaders and go burn them up and get rid of the pupae. But otherwise, it's not. Sanitation measure is not going to be effective. You want to take out the trees because they're poorly formed, but that has no sanitation benefit really.
Okay. And back to the irregular shelterwoods, do you consider irregular shelterwoods to be a traditional even-aged management, or would you be looking at uneven-aged management when leaving reserves, growing stock, and establishing regeneration?
I think it's clearly it's not an even-aged approach. I know that the old sticklers, we need to get by terminology that was popular 30 years ago, like when I went to forestry school, where we get into these rigid definitions. Well, if it's got to be shelterwood means even aged. It doesn't mean even aged. Shelterwood is a regeneration method. The trees don't care that are regenerating what the age structure of the stand they're in is. So that one slide I had that in particular is meant to address this very directly, the one with Kevin O'Hare's book on it, Multi-Age Silviculture. Irregular shelterwood is a multi-age method because it leaves structure, right? You've got at least 2 cohorts or more always operating out there in the site. And it's shelterwood because you're regenerating from advanced regeneration. So I have no problem at all combining those things and talking about them as a legitimate multi-aged or uneven age, if you want to use that term, older term, system. Okay. I know my friend Ralph Nyland has a little more of a resistance to that, but that's just semantics. It's not about what's actually happening out there in the forest. I think the Germans, when they describe these Fammelschlags, they didn't get involved with this. I mean, they're trying to create conditions where we're leaving the optimal structure and regenerating the trees we want. And then, as Dave Smith used to say, that's what we should focus on. And then once we're done, we can probably find a name somewhere in the silviculture lexicon to describe that. And in this case, that becomes irregular group shelterwood in my mind. And it's truly a multi-age system.
And just following up on that, there's a comment from Mike who says maybe we should be calling it irregular aged system?
An irregular age system. Well, that in some ways, yes. That would be, I guess, useful if we had a regeneration process that was not a Shelterwood one. I'm not trying to think of what that might be. Maybe coppice. And irregular, actually, in some ways, if it has meant uneven age, right? It can also mean irregular height structure, which height we tend to equate with age. So, yeah, that could be. I mean, that wouldn't hurt things to go that route. But I like the Shelterwood because it focuses on that great importance of most of our species that need to start out at least in light shade, otherwise you're going to lose.
One last question for you, Bob. A question from Neil. Would you or could your legacy component include snags for wildlife, or would you mark some green trees for topping during later removal of the growing stock left in the establishment cut? And thereby help?
If for some reason you had a clear biological need for more large standing dead trees, then of course you can girdle some of those things. As I said, I guess, I prefer leaving them live. They will eventually die. I mean, obviously we had, as you saw in that one slide, very high survival of these things, which I think is a good thing. Most studies have shown that a lot of them don't last 10 years in clear cuts. They just blow over or die from exposure. That's not true in these gaps. So we would have the option, if you're leaving them in gaps, of going back in and killing some if you found that that was necessary. I tend to think, because they eventually will die, we need better data actually on those dynamics. And yeah, we may have a sort of a second growth stand that's deficient in large woody material. Sure, you can drop some of those if you want to, but then you'll have fewer standing cavity trees for the things like pileateds that need large live trees to nest, and goshawks and all those other structural attributes. So that's a trade-off. So I err on the side of leaving them up and then accepting that they will die and eventually fall over.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bob. With that, that was the end of the questions. So with that, just wanted to thank you, Bob, for your time and for your presentation this morning, and thank everybody for participating. As you can see on the screen, Bob's email address is on the bottom part of that slide, so if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact him directly.
Yeah.
And so just a couple of quick parting reminders for folks on the webinar this morning. A number of you have signed in as staff, and so you may not receive a survey at the end of the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and, before I close out the webinar this morning, I will go ahead and put a link to a survey in the chat box. So please go ahead, if you don't mind copying that link before you sign out of the webinar, go ahead and copy that link. I will also follow up by email with folks with a link to that survey so that you can get your continuing education credits. And then lastly, as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, our last webinar as a part of this series will be in May, and we'll be joined by Dr. Bill Keaton, who will be sharing some of his research that's been going on up at UVM. So with that, again, thank you so much, Bob, for your time this morning. I appreciate you sharing all your research and your knowledge on this topic. And to everybody else, thank you again for participating, and have a great day.